All right, thank you so much for joining us for the virtual Sci-Fi Fantasy Fest. It is 2:30, and we are starting the Why So Serious? Pulp versus Literature in Genre Fiction. We have Bobby, we have Denise, Jared, Sean, and Van all presenting. So without further ado, I will turn this over to you guys.
Okay, well, if y'all don't mind, I went and put my pulp hat on for this, and I brought show and tell.
Wait. Are we supposed to do that? There we go.
There we go. All right, bring it.
Damn, I don't own one. I don't own a hat.
I'm supposed to get my trench now. There we go. I'll be all set.
I wasn't told that there would be hats.
Well, here's the thing. A good detective always has a hat.
That's right.
I'm not a good detective.
Dan's got the best head out of all of us. So. Love you, buddy.
I have my pulp hat upstairs, but I don't want to leave you for 5 minutes while I go look for it. So.
Right. Well, I just want to start with a little history and explanation of why I came up with this panel idea. Let's start with is pulp versus literature, which of course is a false dichotomy. There's no reason you can't have both simultaneously, your chocolate and your peanut butter, but we're going to talk about the evolution of science fiction and genre fiction from one to the other and where they meet in the middle. Pulp, as defined by the American Heritage Dictionary in the opening credits of Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino, is a magazine or book containing lurid subject matter and being characteristically printed on rough, unfinished paper. And this is how science fiction was born. This is my February 1951 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories, which fell apart and someone stapled back together on its lurid, pulpy, brown paper that I am afraid to open up and crinkle. Interestingly, the cover story here is Overlords of Maxis by Jack Vance. Jack Vance being one of the ones I would go to as one of the literary masters of the genre, starting off here in a pulp rag. But, you know, science fiction, for all you out there in cyberspace, was not always paperbacks and New York Times bestsellers and HBO series. It started off in these cheap pulp magazines where we had Edgar Rice Burroughs and his John Carter stories serialized, where space opera got its birth with E. Doc Smith and the Lensman and Edward Hamilton and all of those fine authors. And even people we consider the greats, Isaac Asimov, I, Robot, this is a collection of short stories that appeared in Astounding, one of the main pulp magazines of the day, which is where, yes, science fiction started off with Verne and Wells and the scientific romances of the 1800s, and even going back as far as Mary Shelley, but as a genre, what we think of had really lowbrow origins, the same as horror and fantasy and weird tales and all the crime magazines and the True Confessions and all that. I guess the first author I can think of to kind of break out of the pulps and got some respectability was, of course, Ray Bradbury. Is one of the first respectable science fiction ones and kind of led the charge out of there. But the pulp magazine market crashed. I guess it was either late 50s or early 60s. One of the main distributors of pulp magazines to newsstands went bankrupt overnight. And then all these magazines collapsed and only a few were left on the shelves. So science fiction kind of moved into a different direction, novel length, and came the new wave of science fiction in the 60s and 80s where the writers stopped worrying so much about what new scientific gizmo or gadget was going to feature in the story and what can we do with weird experimental things with voices and characters and what we call literary elements, like just telling stories in new ways, which gave us guys like Alfred Bester of The Demolished Man and Tiger, to use the official title of that book, or the guy considered to be the James Joyce of science fiction, Samuel Delany, good stuff will twist your brain into all new shapes. Roger Zelazny, absolutely Roger Zelazny, Lord of Light, This Immortal, and she's not usually included as a new wave author, but I've got to throw in Ursula Le Guin as someone who took the tropes of science fiction and used them to tell different kinds of stories about different kinds of issues than all the boys in the boys club had been doing before then. And of course, a lot of this, again, you want to pick one person. I kind of put in the middle of the new wave as Michael Moorcock. He became editor of New Worlds magazine in Britain, and he published a lot of these authors starting out. Although he himself, he would experiment and do weird things, but he was pulpy as all get out. Just example of his Nomad of the Time Streams, which I consider him to be the father of steampunk with his series. But I've got this complete collection of like all of his Eternal Champion books, and in one of them I read recently is 3 books that he admits that he wrote as filler for New Worlds because the material he was publishing was too highbrow, and he needed some stuff that's a little bit trashier to fill out the magazine. So he wrote some trashy novels himself to keep the pulp cred. And so that brings us, after the new wave, we kind of launched into the modern era where science fiction, there's no reason science fiction couldn't touch on the same themes as any other genre, highbrow, lowbrow, or anything. Orson Scott Card wrote a book on writing science fiction that I read really when I was young. And he said there, science fiction is a literary ghetto within which you will always be looked down on and disparaged by everyone else in the writing community, but within which you are free to do whatever you want, which is, to write and experiment and do things no one else can. And of course, today we have rock stars like Neil Gaiman, writing Neil Gaiman writing fantasy that is taught in college. We have Margaret Atwood, who, I don't know if she still denies that she's science fiction, but she did for the longest time just because of the stigma that's attached to being genre, and she wanted her stuff to be considered higher than that. And we have all these authors just writing stuff that's gone mainstream now, so we're not quite as looked down on. But the pulp, in my mind, brought something, just an energy and an excitement to it. So my question for the panel is, do you feel the genre is retaining the energy and the excitement of the pulp, or I don't know, are we trying to impress ourselves too much with how highbrow we can go with some of this material?
No.
Well, I guess I mean it depends. It depends on what kind of pulp you're talking about. like anything else, like anything genre or otherwise, you kind of get a subset of different pulps. Like for instance, Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, which is, I love that movie. It was ahead of its time. Is super pulp. Like you watch it and you're opening a pulp novel. But then you go and you have something, you go and you want to go over to the board gaming community and you play something like Mansions of Madness, which is pulp fiction meets H.P. Lovecraft. So, I mean, I suppose the question is more pertinent if you ask yourself, am I trying to force an idea into the story? Am I trying, a good story will have political commentary. A good story will reflect the time that we're in. A bad story will force it. So are you trying? Are you overtly trying to be highbrow? Because if you are, then yeah, you're trying too hard. And you can say that pulp fiction tries too hard. But if you're not trying, if you let a story be a story, and then no, I wouldn't say pulp is trying too hard. In fact, I would say that pulp is trying to come back and find its place within the community again.
Yeah, to me, it's hard to, like you said earlier, it's not really a dichotomy. It's not an either or. It's the same tools. Both types of writers, highbrow, lowbrow, they use the same toolbox. They all have characterization. They all have symbolism. They all have metaphor. They all have turns of phrase. Just the way you use those and how much you stick to the surface and how much and I don't even want to say intentionally put stuff underneath necessarily, because it's not really what the author puts in anymore. Literary criticism is all about what the reader takes away and how something that's supposed to mean this can mean this now, right? So it's a different animal nowadays, I think because of deconstructionism, that each writer gets to put their own stuff onto, each reader, gets to put their own stuff onto it. And so suddenly, things that were written as one thing can be interpreted as something else, right? So it's everybody's playing in the same toolbox. So it's not really two different things. I think sometimes, I think to answer your question, I think there are writers who, and it's not going to be on a writer by writer basis. There are some writers who try to take something that's a very surfacey story and try to capture too much with it, try to say something bigger with it, and it falls flat. And then there are others who, I think, like Denise said, it just comes naturally to them. They have certain tropes, certain concepts and things that are part of their worldview that just come through in a story regardless. Bradbury, I think, is a wonderful one of those. He has this sort of idealistic naturalism for a sci-fi story, that he sees the future, but he sees it in terms of kind of what's already here and through people, and rather than through technology. Yes. And those are very high themes. So they're very literary in that sense. But it was just part and parcel of who he was as a writer. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what it gets down to. I think Atwood is another good example. She takes these sci-fi tropes and she writes about these much bigger themes. But I don't think, a lot of times, I don't think it's an intentional thing, or they're trying to write a lit thing. It's who they are as a writer.
Can I say the earliest writers in sort of the whole pulpy early sci-fi, astonishing, all that. By the way, a really good book to read is Astonishing by Alec Navalny, that kind of goes back into these writers in the early days. But they were all very homogenous. It was all 20, 30, 40-year-old white guys coming back from World War II or about to go to World War II. And they were all writing basically the same thing. They were all like, how can the answer to this story's question be atomic power, right? How can atomic energy solve this problem? Or create the problem by causing giant insects or giant animals, monsters, or whatever, So that's where they were coming from. And they were just trying to find ways to shoehorn the latest science in, and that was the latest science. They were all kind of writing the same thing. Whereas today, it's like we're so diverse, and it's great, not complaining, but we're so diverse in the field of literature that even sci-fi and pulp and everything like that has gotten very balkanized to the point that, when you talk about a trend, you have to specify, well, do I mean these people or this kind or this thing, because like if you look at what Bain is putting out, that's very different from what like Tor is putting out, or what like the magazines might be putting out, or or small press or the new pulp crowd like us, some of us, it's just there's just so many different. There was just like one stream back then, and now there's lots of streams. So it's hard to describe a trend today. How do you describe a trend across 15 different streams? You know what I mean? So
plus in those days, those guys were churning out those stories like really quick. Oh, yeah. It was like I need a 10,000 word story by the end of the weekend, and they would just sit down and they would knock these things out really quick. Yeah. Maybe once, not anymore. I've slowed down a little bit in my old age. But yeah, it was one of those things that, and those guys weren't going in thinking, am I, inspiring the future or anything like that. They were like, I've got a house payment to make. Let me.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. And that makes for a really good point too, because these guys, they weren't thinking about it. Like everybody wants to say, oh, Shakespeare he knew what he was doing, that he would influence the next generation. But no, Shakespeare wanted to make a buck and he wanted to make fun of royalty. That's all he wanted to do. That's it. That's it. And he wanted to tell a really, 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 really long dick joke. That's all he wanted to do. That was it. And if you think about it, that's all anybody wants to do. They want to make money, but in the sense, like take H.P. Lovecraft, for instance. We all know, anybody knows he was racist. He was so racist that other racists were like, whoa, buddy, hold on, hold up a minute. We need you to take like 2 steps back. But in that, he made really good horror because he was so scared of the unknown that he literally put that into his mythos. And if you read into it, I mean, if you knock out the racism, which isn't difficult to do because it's staring at you in the face, you can see the uncertainty that he had and you know, the rest of the nation had, because it's not just one man. If you look at it, he was so scared of like air conditioning, for God's sake. He made an entire story about air conditioning. But that's what good stories do. One, you want to make money off of it. Dickens wanted to make money. Language. Lovecraft wanted to tell stories because he was terrified of everything. And it worked. So that's the beauty of pulp, I think, and especially when it comes to like the horror side of pulp, because let's be real, you've got horror, you've got like Stephen King horror, you got R.L. Stein horror, and then you've got H.P. Lovecraft horror, which is intrinsically linked to pulp, which is why you always see those games or those settings. You got a private detective, you can guarantee there's going to be a tentacle monster in one of the stories somewhere. It's just that's what's going to happen. It wouldn't be. So I wouldn't be surprised if Perry Mason has one at one point. You have pulp horror, and it's so good because it's being unable to stop that unknown, being unable to buck, and somebody was deeply afraid of change and what was coming. And it's a beautiful thing about pulp, you know?
I think, too, that what gets missed is that pulp, sort of simplicity of storytelling that was pulp that helped define it, just as much as the paper it was printed on, I think, that influenced what later became literature, too. I mean, Hemingway is known for short, simple sentences, straight concepts, right? But nobody would ever call Hemingway a pulp writer. He's a literary writer. I mean, it all has to do with theme. His style was no different, really, from Dashiell Hammett or from Lovecraft's way of putting sentences together, or from any of the hundreds of other people whose names can never be remembered because they only wrote 1 or 2 stories, or because they were pen names. But the style ended up becoming what was becoming, you know, lit, and then that style continued to evolve into what is now like the summer bestseller, right? Those things are not written for highbrow audiences. Those are written as simplistically as they can to tell a very surfacey story, whether it's about love or aliens or murder, you know. But all that had its birth in that simple storytelling of pulp that was moving away from the idea that something had to be older to be good necessarily. Like, no, this is who we are now, and this is the kind of story we're going to tell.
Yeah. And I don't think, I know the pulp magazines and all kind of went away after a while, but I don't think pulp, people stopped writing pulp. I think they just started calling it something else, you know. Yeah, certainly the men's adventure novels of the 60s and 70s, or the things like your Mac Bolan and things like, you know, the Destroyer, Remo Williams, and all those. Those are as pulpy as they can be, but they weren't referred to as pulp novels, I think. And, you know, I mean, the one I always tell people when they go, well, what do you consider pulp? And to put it in terms of people that don't read those kind of things, Indiana Jones is a pulp movie.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not called that.
It's got a cliffhanger every 15 minutes. It's structured just like an old Saturday morning matinee.
Yeah, absolutely.
On purpose, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one interesting writer, I guess, whose career spans all of this, and if you read his work, you can see the whole flow of, I suppose, where science fiction went, for me, is Robert Silverberg. Subterranean Press has a 9-volume collected stories of Silverberg, with every story with an introduction by him that spans his entire career. They're dirt cheap, like $3.99 for ebooks for each one, and it actually has a 0 volume that's not part of the series, but it's all the stories that were so early and so raw and so rough and unfinished and pulpy that he was embarrassed to put them in the main collection. And half of those are written under pseudonyms and pen names, and some of them was like, I think I wrote this story. This sounds like me. Let me put this one in here. But when he was just knocking them off like every day, write a new story. But it's interesting there because you can see the flow of him where he started off and he's just working for a living. He has to make so many words to make his New York rent paycheck. And then there's a spot there where he wants to get a story in for Powell Anderson, I think. And Anderson like says to him, you know, you're good, but you could do better than this. And he starts making a conscious effort in his writing to not worry about the word count and grinding it out so much as to improve the style and the quality and the themes in his work. And then, you know, that just, at some point he shifts from, you know, the cheap magazines into like Omni and Playboy and the slicks as they were in the 70s and 80s, where
those were the slicks in the 70s, 80s. Yeah. He had a roommate too, didn't he? There was another big writer that was living with Silverberg. I want to say
Harvey Harlan, or I'm sorry, I think
wasn't Harlan Ellison. It was
no, they knew each other pretty well, but yeah, it wasn't.
I just for some reason that rings a bell that Silverberg was living with another person and they were writing big stuff at the same time and kind of bouncing ideas off each other, but I don't recall who it was. I don't remember where I read that. That may have been in that Astonishing book toward the end.
Yeah.
Later on.
I know I know that there's an audiobook of a Harlan Ellison novella called Run for the Stars, I think, where he claims that he and Silverberg had a competition between each other to see how many could string more exclamation marks in a row after an exclamation and get it by an editor. So in his story, he like wins with like, he has a, "Aye!" where the guy's like 20 exclamation marks. So he beats Silverberg.
Sounds like Jack Kirby's scripting right there.
It's amazing too. I mean, we were talking about the old pulps and the slicks, and you know how the pulps were considered like the throwaway material, and the slicks were the highbrow, the stuff you wanted to. But what does everybody collect now? It's collecting the old throwaway stuff. There's not too many people collecting the slicks.
What's in the beautiful leather-bound, acid-free, collections now is like Conan the Barbarian and Solomon Kane and all it, and John Carter. It's not whatever. I mean, I if you put a gun to my head and said, name me one story from the slicks back then where the author made a whole lot more money than those guys, I'd be like, you're gonna have to shoot me because I have no idea, no clue. That's what I remember. Uh-oh.
You asked earlier, Jared, about writers trying different, the pulp writers are kind of trying different things. And I think that's one of the things that I like so much about this new pulp movement that Van recommended. And it's a conversation that another new pulp author, Eric Ferguson, has had plenty of times where you don't shut down any of your toolkit. You play with all of it. And you can write stories that say something, that have bigger themes. It's not sci-fi, but Bob and I have a series that we've done about a PI named Rick Ruby. And those stories, at least in my mind, are clearly about racism and sexism and what it's like to be a man living in that world and not believe those things, just try to exist in that world but it takes place in the world of 30s PIs. So there's certain walls that you're always going to bump into, right? But to me, you can intentionally set those things in a way that allows you to tell grander stories without tacking them on, because the world of 30s is that. It's totally that. You can't get around it. So if I just put a guy in that story, that's going to be part of the story without me having to tack on themes and all that, right? So I think, there's some ways of doing that. And in terms of like Derek's story, his Dylan stories, it's a black Doc Savage in essence, in a lot of ways, but instead of telling these intentionally political tales, he's telling a good adventure yarn, which makes it a much more effective way of addressing those themes, because it's not off-putting at all, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can do that, and that's one of the things I love about what's going on in New Pulp, is we can address some of those issues and some of those things that have been negatives, like H.P. Lovecraft's racism, right? We can look at those stories, tell those kinds of stories, a new sense of social consciousness, without trying to sound too woke or anything. But
want that, John.
we can address those kinds of things by telling the kinds of stories we like. And in essence, it's a way of using that thing that we love so much from the past, and still trying to, you know, address different themes and address different ideas and say something bigger than some of the stories may have done in the past.
Yeah, you can hide an allegory or a message with ray guns and monsters. You know, I mean, you know, to take it back into TV, certainly the original Star Trek was a master of this. You know, they were telling stories that were about one thing, but on the screen, what you were seeing was, you know, two guys fighting, you know, and ray guns shooting. And so you can use those trappings to tell a story that they don't realize they're getting, but you're not beating anybody over the head with it.
Well, except when Roddenberry beat people over the head with the fact that he hated hippies.
Well, sure, yeah.
And he loved JFK, right?
Well, to be absolutely fair, the hippie episode was after he left the show. He can't be blamed for that one.
He hated hippies and he loved JFK. And,
And go
he
figure.
went to his grave.
I love that episode, though.
You know, one recent trend for the last few years, and since I was a librarian acquiring books, I kind of was all of a sudden realized all these things were coming out, was I kind of enjoyed the return of the novella as a form.
Yeah.
Because that kind of forced authors to tell their stories with the more, I guess, economic language and structure of a good, fast-paced pulp story, to do the same things. Like, especially around, I was looking at my Goodreads list here. It seems around 2016, there was a rash of novellas of retelling of H.P. Lovecraft from more diverse perspectives. I've got right here The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow by Kiz
Oh, that was
Johnson.
a good novella.
Came out about the same time as The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval. And Cassandra Caw had a couple of novellas at the same time. They're all playing with either a direct inspiration from Lovecraft themes or playing with those themes and doing in a novella format that made them, they're still focusing on viewpoints that weren't explored by pulp authors in the past. They're still using some language and some, I guess, more linguistic styles instead of just the same old trope stuff. But just the length of the novella forces an economy and a pace that, in my mind, says to me, pulp fiction. You know, it's not the languid, oh, let's take a little while to tell the story, and it's just like, we got to get to it, and get the story and get it out there.
And I think part of that.
The mountains like you do in Donaldson.
Yeah.
You don't get 10 pages of the mountains were brown like you do in Stephen R. Donaldson.
Right.
Yeah. I think too.
Go ahead, Bobby.
I was gonna say, I think too, part of what helped bring the novella back was the advent of the ebook.
Mm-hmm.
People reading on their phones don't care how thick an ebook is. They're not looking, you know, it's not like when you pick up a paperback and go, oh, this is a thick one, it ought to be good. They're not doing it. They don't care. They don't care about the size. They care about the story.
Right.
And I think with novellas, you can just tell your story. You don't have to, you don't have to stretch and add subplots that aren't important to pad your word count or whatever, you know, and you can allow the story to breathe. And I think the emergence of reading on something other than just paperback helped kind of get that out there.
Well, it wasn't just that.
Well, no, not just that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, you're right, though. It was the advent of ebooks that really pushed the novella. But so I have, before I found out, I much prefer writing comic books to writing actual books. This was when I was in art school. I was really big on trying to write a book, and when you get deep into that community, you find, and especially with the advent of ebooks, you find that 5 tends to be the magic number. If you publish 5 books, then your name gets an uptick and you can sell more. That's the magic number. So what people tended to do was they tended to publish novellas, and just to get their rankings within Amazon higher. Now, of course, this is generalization speaking. This is not always the case. I mean, there are other factors. But for a while there was a push to get your name out there before Amazon changed the algorithm again, and novellas were really it. But you saw with novellas, and I have a series of private eye adventure stories that I'm slowly trying to work into comic book scripts so I can do comics. Alton Bentley, he's my private eye that can talk to the dead. And I found with the novella that a novella really pushes you to keep everything very succinct. You've got a 30,000 word count, and you better tell the story within 30,000 words, and you better do it right, because you've only got this one shot to make it a really, really good, really compelling story. And I found, as I kept reading novellas, they were actually better than a lot of the full-length books that were coming out. Now, keep in mind, a full-length book is considered 50,000 words. That's what it's considered. That's what they have you write in NaNoWriMo. That is a full-length novel. But what a lot of people wind up doing is they either beat you over the head with the themes that they're trying to do, or they lose the plot somewhere. But a novella forces you to keep the plot, because you have to keep the story going. And that was the beautiful thing about the resurgence of the novellas, because with the resurgence of the novellas, you saw more pulp fiction coming out, because they were just, in a sense, they were almost throwaway stories, but they were just a fun little exercise to do. And I mean, great for me, because I love pulp stories, right?
Yeah, the Murderbot Diaries pops into mind. It's a great series of quick pulpy novellas.
Plus,
so much of what Airship 27 and Prose and others publish are anthologies of 15,000 word, long short stories, short novellas about the same character or the same general theme packaged together in 60,000 word, collections. So that's a big promotion too in terms of new pulp.
And it also allows you to.
Not just the novellas, it's also a return to the short novels. I'm seeing a resurgence of what because my favorite sci-fi stories ever are anything I could find from like 65 to 71 in a digest size.
Yeah.
Never seen them run over 200 pages. They're probably, and sometimes they're just novellas that are double spaced just to make the book seem longer. But yeah, they're very small, and a lot of like the publishers that Dan just mentioned, a lot of those guys like Prose and Airship, they're doing these right around 200 page, short novels. And I love that, because my biggest use for a big 700 page fantasy novel is either a doorstep or to throw at birds. I just don't like reading them. They just yes, they're the equivalent of a 6-issue comic book that should have been 2 for me. There's just too much crap in there. There was a lot of stuff thrown at the wall, and I'm not naming names, Van.
We're just pointing at them strongly.
But
trying to incorporate visual aid here.
That's right. But yeah, that return to shorter storytelling, to the point storytelling. I love that. And that's so very pulpy.
Right, because not every story needs to be 100,000 word epic. Not every story needs to be that big. And, I think now that we're in a place now with people self-publishing. I know I do the Snow series, and it's a series of novellas, because I did it for 2 reasons. One, that was kind of the right size for the story, but it also allows me to sell them cheaper, to not be trying to sell $15, $20 books, to try to sell $7 book paperbacks or $2, ebooks, and moving those, and I can still publish 4 of those a year. And it's like I could publish 1 big novel, or I could publish 4 little novels, and it equals the same thing. But it allows me to promote the books throughout the year. And it just from a small business standpoint, that really works for me better than me trying to do 100,000-word novel to put out once a year.
I have a question, and Jared, maybe this is where you were going, or maybe I missed it. We already talked about it. But you know, we draw such a distinction here between, we drew it and then we've been trying to blur it, but between literary and then more pulpy, right? And so we know where Pulp is trying to go. Pulp is trying to tell an exciting, powerful story. Winds of Winter. It's not. It doesn't. Fantasy. That's the fantasy story that it's going to exist. Anyway, so we know what Pulp is about. Pulp doesn't disguise itself. It says, here's what we're going to do. Right? Load your guns, load your spaceship, whatever. Here we go. What is literary fiction trying to do that is so different from this? What makes it? We always look at. We're always on the defensive. Well, here's what pulp is and why it's okay. What is literary fiction and what is it trying to do? That's what I want to know.
Okay, let me attempt to answer that.
Yeah.
Because I was comparing and contrasting a bunch of genres in my last talk I gave. I think with what we consider literary stuff, aside from just being, except for the ones that are just books about English professors having a midlife crisis and an affair with women. Aside from those, I think and essentially it's only a genre because bookstores need to have a place to put books that don't fit in these other categories. But I think when authors are aspiring to something like that, I think it's when an author is trying to capture something authentic about the human experience and put it in a novel. Maybe have to do with a plot, maybe not. But I think that there's just some kind of authentic experience they're trying to articulate in words, and that's my stab at what I'm aiming at. Yeah.
Jesus, bacon, cheddar, and sour cream. You guys are ridiculous.
To me, literary is as equally undefinable as pulp can be sometimes, because pulp, well, what kind of stories are pulp stories? We're sci-fi, horror, action stories, whatever. They're all pulp, And literary can include so much stuff too, because you go from sci-fi, like Vonnegut, all the way down to, these very deep people stories, like Their Eyes Were Watching God. But none of that stuff set out to be highbrow literary. It's somebody telling a story, and I think that's the thing, except for the people who kind of go in it, I'm going to write literature in the same way that you were talking about people talk about Shakespeare, and those people who go in to write literature usually fall on their faces because they're trying too hard. They're not just telling stories, right?
Right.
And I think, and that's what makes it such a hard thing. Lit is so hard to define because the best literary stories, I don't think, were anticipated being literary stories. They really resonated because it was something raw and real in it.
Yeah.
A lot of it depends on the author, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like the publishers and the bookstores get together and say, oh, Michael Crichton wrote this? Well, it technically is science fiction, but we'll put it in the literary section. Oh, Salman Rushdie wrote this? Well, it's fantasy, but we're putting it in the literary section, right? I mean, there's been so many times I've gone to Barnes & Noble looking for something that was clearly science fiction or fantasy, and I can't find it. I'm like, I know they've got it. Oh, I know what they did. And I go over to the literary, and there it
Where do
is.
you find Gaiman?
I honestly think, okay, if I really think literature depends on, I think literature is a graduation, because let's look at this, for instance. Terry Pratchett is literature, but he started as popular fiction. But if you look, my favorite stories in all of Terry Pratchett, my favorite stories are the Night Watch. And if you read the Night Watch, they're a commentary on everything from gun control to bloody well gender norms. I mean, if you look at the story of Cheery Litterbottom, it's a transgender story. They're literature. but they're science fiction. But I think they've graduated into being literature. And I think, like Sean said, Sean and Jared, both of you, I think they have to say something, because for all intents and purposes, Stephen King has been graduated to literature, although I would argue that quite strenuously, but he has been graduated to literature, same as Neil Gaiman. I'm sorry?
I said, yeah, that's another one, yes.
Yeah, Neil Gaiman has been graduated into literature with American Gods, which, I mean, to me is about the only good thing besides Sandman he's ever written, but he's a hit and miss with me. That's personal opinion. You know, so I think in the graduation, I think pulp fiction can actually graduate into literature. But if it makes that graduation, like, you know, Dashiell Hammett, you know, all of our favorite private eyes, they've graduated into literature. And it's because they were either the start of a genre, or they said something within that genre to make it to where it's a universal human experience. And I think, like Sean said, if you set out, I'm going to write literature, you're going to fail. Because if you want, it's like with anything else. If you want to take the hammer and beat it over the head with, you know, beat somebody over the head with it, you're going to fail, because that's not writing literature, that's preaching. You know, that's proselytizing.
I don't know if anyone else here subscribes to David Langford's e-zine Ansible. Read that. Anyway, it's a little short monthly thing he sends out that has updates on like awards and conventions and who's passed away in the last month and all that. There's one little short section in there he always puts called "As Others See Us," and it's quotes from critics or commentators out in the world on something, and there's a general theme in all of them about, well, this story here deals with what might happen in the future, but it's not science fiction. It can't be, because it's good.
It's terrible.
So
well, that's like a million. I mean, Van mentioned Michael Crichton. You know, Michael Crichton, even as he is writing under his own name, he was also writing pulp novels under the name John Lang that did not come out that it was him until after his death. And now those books are being reprinted under his own name, and these pulp novels are being shelved in bookstores under literature.
And you read them, and
Michael Crichton graduated to literature. Jurassic Park is literature.
Yeah.
Right, it is. It's weird, but it's literature. I found Jurassic Park in the literature section. I'm like, what?
It's marketing. It's all, really, in the end, it's all marketing. Bookstores need to know which shelf to put a book on, so that people looking for that book are going to buy it. And what happens there is genre stuff kind of gets slighted because it doesn't get put on the same shelf as Hemingway, you know. But Hemingway's only on that shelf with other authors because they can't fit in a genre. People are going to look in this one spot in the store. It's an artifact of marketing. I can't tell you how many library board meetings I sat through when I was a librarian about, are we going to separate our fiction into genre or just leave it all on the shelf? Because all the libraries have been in, we just slapped it all on the same shelf together and said, it's a book, enjoy it.
Yeah.
Right.
But I also think too, I mean, we've seen publishers too that try to skew it and then have like the best of both worlds, where like they'll take what is clearly a pulp novel with an old pulp painted cover, and they'll release the paperback with that pulpy painted cover on it, but then they release the hardcover with a more modern cover on it.
Right, and that kind of destroys it.
Yeah, so those people that will never touch a pulpy novel with that kind of painted cover on it would read the same book because they think it's something else. So publisher,
how much is that driven by this idea somehow that literature is better than pulp or any other kind of genre fiction? Because I know coming from the artist's perspective, you get into the argument between what is fine art and what is popular art, and you even see it, a lot of my myself included, but a lot of my artist friends, there's an annoyance because like the Disney style is super popular, and when you go into art school, they literally beat it out of you. You have to retrain yourself to draw it in order to get into that popular, because otherwise you won't be looked at. And so and then you have the argument, well, what constitutes art? A banana taped to a wall apparently is art. That is not art, ladies and gentlemen. That is a banana taped to a wall. Picasso, for God's sake, is anyway. So how much of that is driven by these guys sitting in a chair that says, no, Pulp Fiction, ew, we won't touch that. That's too lowbrow. But Hemingway, let's talk about Hemingway. Apparently he's literature. What?
See, those guys in the chairs you're describing are exactly the middle-aged English professors having an affair with their students during their midlife crisis that so many literary novels are about.
Lolita, anyone?
Well, and a lot
Literally
of
defined urban fantasy.
Oh, urban fantasy.
Stylish covers, and we're calling it urban fantasy, so nobody assumes that it's just, you know, crazy horror action stories.
Well, it's what happened when romance as a genre started to drain all the bodice rippers of their source material and had to go start eating other genres. So you had horror romance and fantasy romance and science fiction.
Yeah.
You know,
I miss the bodice ripping book.
Bodice ripper horror, and that's an urban fantasy. You throw it all into one and hit blend. So yeah.
All right, look, the only bodice ripper horror fantasy that you need to read is Anne Rice, because that's where her purple prose is like top.
now for all of us as writers, do these new ways of describing things, how does it impact us when we're trying to sell our books? How does it impact you when you're trying to get people to buy your books? How do you use those keywords? Do you sometimes you think it's one thing, but then you find out other people assume it's something else? And how does that impact you guys as writers?
I mean, you kind of have to watch the bookshelves, don't you? You kind of have to see, like, you have to go to your, for lack of a better term, competitors, and see how they're being shelved and see how they're tagging their books. Because, I mean, ultimately, you want to be as seen as they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the ultimate goal. You want to put your name out there. So you kind of have to, in a way, you kind of have to follow the crowd and test the waters and see, okay, my book, take Alton Bentley, for instance. That's my PI. He's horror because I've got H.P. Lovecraft in there. You know, I've got Miskatonic, I've got Arkham, I've got all of that. But he's also Dashiell Hammett because the way that I've styled the character. So I kind of have to find that sweet spot in between the two genres to see, you know, how I can get my name out there and how I can sell it. So it's in that respect, I think you don't want to be unique. I don't think you want to come up with your own tags for your book. You want to be in that mix, but you want the story to stand out on its own. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, and I think it becomes a greater issue with the whole e-publishing revolution that's happened, because how is all of that stuff categorized, and how do you find out what's what? It's all done by categories. So let's take yours, for example. Is that going to, you know, you're going to find that ultimately under urban fantasy because it's a mixture of horror and PI. But it's not going to be under the same urban fantasy that like the bodice rippers are. And it might not necessarily fit the same thing in the Hollows with the Kim Harrison books. Although it sounds a little closer to that, or maybe Harry Dresden. But, you know,
right.
So it is, but the whole thing's driven by marketing terms, not just, I mean, it's not just on the bookstore shelves where you go, well, where do I find Neil Gaiman, literature or fantasy? Where do I look? Or where do I find, you know, but with new authors, it's a lot of, you know, you go to Amazon, where do I, you know, you can, if you don't know the name of the book and you're just going to discover it like you would walking through a bookstore, where do you discover it? Going through a list of urban fantasy or literature, or, you know, and it becomes very important in that. How do you classify the damn thing?
It would be nice if they just had a section for Pulp Fiction, you know? Throw it all in there. Pulp Fiction.
How do you graduate?
Western,
do you want to?
Well,
or detective stories.
I'm not saying that anybody would want to necessarily, but I'm saying what moves you up? What moved Michael Crichton up? What moved Neil Gaiman up? What did they have to do? Was it sales?
Sales.
Visibility?
an example. I don't think this ever quite made it to what we call literary, but Kevin J. Anderson's Saga of the Seven Suns series. The first 4 books had very sci-fi covers to attract any sci-fi fan. But sales for that series, as it drew towards the end, started to flip him up into more of a mainstream audience. People who weren't necessarily sci-fi fans reading that. So the last 3 books had the most bland covers imaginable, and they went back and reissued all the first 4 books so that each of the covers just had like a sphere sun-shaped thing. It was a different color on each one, and it's his name and the title of the book. Same
That'll
thing
do it.
with George Martin. I mean, the first couple of books, those had fantasy covers that say to a fantasy fan, here's a guy on a horseback with a sword, you want to read this. And then as soon as mainstream, they gave him Danielle Steele covers, where it's just like a solid color, his name, the book name, and like one icon in the middle of it.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with
Yeah, see, that's the one I
Not
read.
anymore.
Yeah.
You don't
it's
see
the
that
same thing with
anymore.
American Gods. Yeah, same thing with American Gods, or even Good Omens. You know, Good Omens was so niche for so long. I mean, I didn't read Good Omens until like 2000s, and it came out back in the 90s. But when it hit, you know, when people started saying, hey, this is the thing, they redid the cover. It got a Danielle Steele cover, and all of a sudden, boom, people are like, well, who's Terry Pratchett? And you can see it with Terry Pratchett. But with Terry Pratchett's covers, the Brits did a good thing with those covers. They don't scream science fiction at you unless you go way back to the 80s when he first started writing this world. Then they scream science fiction at you or fantasy. Nowadays, you can pick up a Terry Pratchett novel and you're like, oh, what's this? And you get super, you know, you start reading it. It's like, oh, this is super science fiction, but you couldn't tell by the covers.
Yeah.
So a lot of that is marketing.
Yeah. I think one author that the rebranding and marketing did a disservice to was Octavia Butler.
Yeah.
Because when her stuff was flat out full on science fiction, but as soon as the MFAs and the professors of English literature got a hold of her and said, this is serious, important works, all of her books got rebranded in such a way that a casual science fiction reader would think, oh, that's like Hemingway crap, I don't want to read that, and they would never touch it. You know, we had her stuff at the Hoover Library when I was working in the fiction department there. We had all of Octavia Butler's books on the science fiction shelf because that's where she was, but their presentation was so much of this is an important piece of work that they just sat there and no one ever picked them up. They never moved. All the books around them did, but those never did.
Cuts both ways.
That is a shame because she is wonderful.
Crime fiction figured that out years ago. If you look at most like Michael Connelly type covers, it's just the names. There's maybe like it evokes like a bridge in the background or a dark street light on a street or something, but it's not like you'd see on a sci-fi or fantasy cover. You know, in other words, if crime fiction had the covers that sci-fi and fantasy do, you'd have the old pulp covers with a guy in a hat and a coat, a trench coat. And all that. Yeah, you'd have all that, but they don't because they're not selling.
Give me like 5 minutes and I can design you a crime fiction novel cover. Drives me nuts. 5 minutes, that's all I need.
Those are what draw me to crime fiction are those covers. That's the reason I love that. I mean, that's why I'll pick up a hard case crime novel, even if it sucks a lot of times, because it's just the cover makes me go, oh, I want to read that. It's that, you know, you hit the word lurid earlier. It tells you so much lurid that it is. And then you read it and you go, oh, this may have been about burlesque dancers, but nobody was ever naked in this book, you know. And the book makes a tease, and I think that was so important. It teases you into thinking you're getting something that's so much harder than it is, and then you read the story and you go, oh, this is just a great story, you know. And then you're hooked by that time, you know. But then the next cover comes along, it does it all over again. The G-string.
Hard Case is doing that. They're the only one.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. I mean, the G-string murders was made into what would be the equivalent of a G movie with Barbara Stanwyck. And I'm like, there's some, you know,
how funny.
You know, I suppose the imprint. I'm not sure if they're still putting these out or not, but the imprint that I kind of consider the science fiction equivalent of the hard case crime is Planet Stories from Paizo. reprinting a bunch of classics, and they do it with like the old Plant Stories magazine. The big Plant Stories logo is bigger than the title of the book. They just the things just scream, "This is good old fashioned pulpy sci-fi." You don't have to worry about anyone getting all. You don't have to worry about James Joyce sneaking in here. You know?
Yeah, don't worry about that. No, it's no.
Yeah.
I was worried about James Joyce.
I was, but now I'm fine. You
That's good
reassured
that I
me.
don't have to worry about it. Thank you.
Of course, if Planet ever publishes a Samuel Delaney thing, then James Joyce will be sneaking in there. But
Back to your very first question about some of the things that are different. What is pulp type or style fiction doing differently from stuff published as literary fiction? Hard Case Crime and Planet shows you that there's a dress for those things, right? If you like it, find it. If I look for a yellow tab across the top of that book as I'm walking down the mystery section, I know I found the book I want. If I look and I see Planet up there, I know I found it. But a literary, something that's going to go marketed as a literary book, it's going to be a unique package that looks like everything else, but it doesn't look immediately like everything else from the spine. And all that. It doesn't pair it up with anything else by making the trade dress similar and all that. And that is one thing that they're doing that you could argue that, you know, for pulp, it's helping draw people to it by finding the trade dress, and for literary, it's keeping it an eyebrow thing, because if it suddenly trade dressed it, then it would diminish it somehow.
Yeah. Yep. Is that time, Madeline? Or we?
It's time.
It is time, I believe.
I was about to say, yeah, that is about time, because we do have another panel at 4. We've got the writers group, and I think a lot of y'all are on that as well. So we'll give you a little break in between. But thank you so much for talking about pulp fiction. I learned some of what pulp is, so I understand now that it's a little bit nebulous to describe, but it was now I know that like some of the things that I've been reading, you know, would classify as pulp, and I wouldn't have thought of that. So I learned a lesson today too. So thank you again for participating, and we'll see you on panels later, I'm sure. So thank you. We'll have this recorded and posted to our YouTube next week.
Yay!
all right.
See ya.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Later.